My name is Alex, and I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be taken to that place. To be pulled into a world I knew nothing about. But when he looked at me, when he whispered my name in the dark, I knew I was never getting out the same. He was danger and protection, strength and vulnerability, and the night he took me to that secret place, it changed everything. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's how this all started. Or maybe I was in the right place at the right time. And I just didn't know it yet. The night was thick and humid, the city lights flickering like ghosts in the distance. As I stepped outside the bar, I needed air, the noise, the heat, the press of bodies. It was too much. I tugged at the collar of my shirt, exhaling as I leaned against the brick wall, letting the cool breeze skim across my skin. That's when I saw him. He was standing under the dim glow of a street lamp, arms crossed, watching me, tall, built like he was made of stone, shoulders broad beneath the dark fabric of his jacket. A soldier. Even in the low light, I could tell the way he stood, straight-backed, aware, like he could handle anything the world threw at him. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and unreadable, and just like that, I couldn't look away. I should have ignored him. I should have walked back inside, pretended I didn't see the way he was watching me, like he already knew me. But I didn't. Instead, I took a step forward, then another, until we were just feet apart. The distant hum of the city was the only thing between us. "What?" I asked. His gaze didn't waver. "You're in the wrong place." Something in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't comforting either. "I don't think I am," I said. His jaw tightened. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away. I should have let him go. I should have stayed where I was, gone back inside, forgotten about the way he looked at me. But something about him, about the weight in his voice, the tension in his shoulders, the way he walked like he carried things no one else could see, made me follow. He knew I was behind him. I could tell by the way he slowed, just slightly, like he was giving me a choice, to turn back, or to keep going. I kept going, and when he finally stopped, when he finally turned to face me, the world felt quieter, like whatever was about to happen next would change everything. I should have turned back. I should have let him disappear into the night. Let whatever this was die before it even started. But I didn't, because there was something about him, something raw, something unspoken, that made it impossible to walk away. We stood in the shadows of the alley, the street lights behind us casting long, flickering silhouettes against the brick walls. He didn't speak, just stood there watching me, the silence stretching between us, thick with something I didn't understand. Then, finally, he exhaled. "You shouldn't have followed me." My pulse kicked up. And yet, here I am. His jaw tensed, like he wanted to say something, something that would push me away. But he didn't. Instead, he tilted his head, studied me like he was trying to figure out what the hell I was doing here. Then, without another word, he turned and started walking. Not toward the city, not toward anything familiar, but deeper into the dark. I hesitated, just for a second, because this was insane. I didn't know his name, didn't know where he was leading me, didn't know if I was making the worst mistake of my life. But my feet moved anyway, following him into the night. The city faded behind us. The lights, the noise, the people, all of it disappeared, swallowed by the quiet. And still, he didn't speak, just kept walking, leading me through winding streets, back roads, empty lots. The silence should have been unnerving, but it wasn't, because something about him, about the way he moved, about the way he carried himself, about the way his shoulders stayed tense like he was always ready for a fight, made me feel like I was walking beside a storm barely held together. And I wanted to know what happened when it broke. Finally, after what felt like forever, he stopped. We were in front of an old, run-down warehouse, its exterior rusted, windows boarded up. I frowned. "This where you kill me?" The first time that night. He smirked. It was small, barely there, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. Because that was the first real thing he had given me. The first crack in the armor. The first sign that there was something more beneath the cold exterior. Then, without a word, he unlocked the door and stepped inside, leaving me with a choice, to walk away, or to follow him into the unknown. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the scent of metal, and something older, something lived in. I squinted in the dim light, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The place, there were no broken bottles, no discarded needles, No signs of something dangerous. Instead, maps, weapons, military gear, stacked neatly along the walls. And in the center of it all, a cot, a desk, a chair, a life hidden in the dark. I turned to him, my pulse still racing. "You live here?" He didn't answer. Not with words. Instead, he took off his jacket, draped it over the chair, and finally met my gaze. "Close the door." A command. Low, controlled, like he was used to people obeying. Like he expected me to listen. And I did, because for some reason, I wanted to. I closed the door, not because he told me to, but because I wanted to. Because the moment I stepped inside, the moment I saw the way he watched me, something shifted, something dangerous, something I wasn't ready for, but couldn't walk away from. The air inside was heavy. Not just from the dust, not just from the scent of old metal and oil and sweat, but from him, from the way he stood there, shoulders tense, jaw tight, like he was still deciding if letting me in was a mistake. Like maybe he wanted to take it back, but he didn't. Instead, he reached for a bottle of water on the desk, unscrewed the cap, and took a slow sip, never breaking eye contact, like he was waiting for me to speak, for me to move, for me to do something that would make him stop fighting whatever the hell this was. I leaned against the door. "So, what is this place?" His fingers tightened around the bottle before he set it down. "It's mine." That was it. No explanation, no elaboration, just two words, sharp and absolute. Like that was all I needed to know. Like that was all he was willing to give. I scanned the room again. The maps, the military gear, the cot that looked too small for someone like him. The walls covered in notes, coordinates, red lines connecting places I didn't recognize. I nodded toward them. Still on a mission. "Soldier?" His jaw ticked, like he didn't like me calling him that. Like maybe that part of his life was something he wanted to leave behind. But he didn't correct me. He just exhaled, ran a hand over his face, then looked back at me with something unreadable in his expression. "You shouldn't be here." I let out a small laugh. "You're the one who brought me." His lips pressed into a thin line. "Yeah," he murmured. "That was a mistake. Something about that pissed me off. I wasn't a mistake. And whatever the hell was happening between us, neither was that." I stepped forward. "Then why'd you do it?" He didn't answer, didn't move, didn't look away. So I kept going. Another step, then another, until I was standing so close I could hear the way his breath hitched. His hands clenched at his sides. His entire body tense, like he was holding something back, like he was fighting himself. I tilted my head. "You're not going to tell me, are you?" He swallowed hard. Then, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "I don't know. I should have backed off. Should have let it go. But instead, I reached out. My fingers barely brushed his wrist. And his reaction was instant. His hand shot up, grabbing mine, gripping it tight, like he was trying to stop himself from doing something worse. Like maybe he wanted to pull me closer. Like maybe he wanted this as much as I did. The air between us was thick, heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain, but didn't want to stop. I licked my lips, my heart hammering in my chest. "Tell me to leave," I whispered. His grip tightened, his breathing shallowed, his fingers twitched against my skin. And then, so low, so wrecked, so full of something I wasn't ready for. "I can't." Neither of us moved, not for a long time. Not until his hand finally loosened. Not letting go, not pushing me away, just holding on to me, to whatever the hell was happening between us. To something I knew was bigger than both of us. And when he finally exhaled, when he finally looked at me like he had stopped fighting himself, I knew I wasn't going anywhere. Neither of us were. His fingers were still wrapped around my wrist. His grip tight but not painful. Firm, steady, like he was anchoring himself to something he didn't understand. Like he didn't want to let go. And I didn't want him to. The air in the room was too still. The kind of silence that pressed against your chest, made it hard to breathe. I could feel his pulse against my skin. Uneven, like he was barely holding himself together. His breathing was just as ragged. And when I looked up at him, really looked at him, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. This wasn't just tension. It wasn't just desire buried under years of control. It was fear, not of me, but of himself. "You're shaking," I murmured. His grip on me tightened. Just for a second. Then, finally, he let go. He stepped back, dragging a hand through his hair. His jaw tight, his shoulders stiff, like he was trying to put walls back up that had already cracked. "I can't do this," he muttered. My chest tightened. "Can't do what?" He didn't answer, didn't look at me, just turned away, his back to me, his body coiled like a wire about to snap. I took a slow breath. I could have left. I could have walked out. Let him shove everything back down. Let him bury himself under whatever weight he was carrying. But I didn't, because he had already let me in. Maybe not with words, but with this. The way he touched me. The way he held on just a little too long. The way he looked at me like he was searching for something he didn't know how to name. I wasn't walking away. Not now. Not after this. "You keep saying you can't do this," I said, stepping toward him. "But you're the one who brought me here." His shoulders tensed. "You're the one who let me in." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "And you're the one who can't stop looking at me like." "Stop," he snapped. I froze. His breath was uneven. His body coiled so tight I thought he might break. And then he turned. His eyes were dark, burning with something raw, something wrecked, something I wasn't sure he even understood. "I don't know how to do this," he said, his voice rough. I swallowed hard. "Then let me show you." Neither of us spoke, not for a long time. Just stood there staring at each other, waiting to see who would break first. And then he moved, fast, before I could think, before I could breathe. His hands were on me, gripping my face, pulling me in, crashing his lips against mine. It wasn't soft. It wasn't careful. It was desperate, like he had been holding this back for years. And finally, let himself have it. His hands trembled against my skin. His breath ragged. His body pressed so close I could feel the way his chest rose and fell against mine. I felt like I was drowning in him, and I didn't want to come up for air. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against mine. His fingers still tangled in my shirt. His breath still uneven. "This is a mistake," he whispered. I exhaled, just as shaky. "Then why does it feel right?" His fingers twitched, like he wanted to deny it, like he wanted to lie. But he didn't, because we both knew the truth. This wasn't a mistake. This was inevitable. And no matter how much he tried to fight it, there was no turning back now. I should have pulled away. I should have let him step back. Let him bury this moment under whatever weight he was carrying. But I didn't, because the way he was looking at me now, like he was unraveling, like he was fighting himself and losing, told me everything I needed to know. He didn't want to stop. Neither did I. His hands were still on me. Fingers curled into my shirt. Like if he let go he'd lose something. Like he'd lose me. His forehead was still resting against mine. His breath shallow, shaky, wrecked. "This is going to ruin me," he whispered. I swallowed hard. "No, it won't." His grip tightened. His body tensed. Like he didn't believe me. Like he was waiting for an excuse to run. But I wasn't going to give him one. Not now. Not after this. I reached up, fingers brushing against the rough stubble on his jaw, tilting his face just enough so he had no choice but to look at me. His dark eyes were burning, full of something I couldn't name. Something sharp, and raw, and desperate. I licked my lips, my heart pounding. "Tell me you don't want this." He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Then, so low, so wrecked, so painfully honest, "I can't." I kissed him, and this time, he didn't hold back. He took everything. One hand slid into my hair, gripping tight, pulling me closer, like he needed me, like I was the only thing keeping him standing. His other hand found my waist, fingers pressing in, holding, grounding himself. His kiss was hot, deep, a clash of desperation and restraint finally breaking. I could feel the way he was shaking, the way his muscles tensed, like he was at war with himself. But he wasn't fighting anymore. Not this, not me. When we finally broke apart, our breathing was rough, our bodies still pressed too close, our hands still holding on. His fingers twitched against my skin, like he wasn't ready to let go, like he was afraid to. His eyes flickered, uncertainty, fear, something deeper. I exhaled, my hands sliding to his wrists, holding them gently. "I'm not going anywhere," I murmured. His throat bobbed, his grip tightened, just for a second. Then, finally, he let out a breath. A slow, heavy, shaking breath, like he had just lost a fight he never wanted to win. That night, we didn't talk about it, didn't define it, didn't question it. We just sat together in the dim light of the warehouse, shoulders barely touching, the silence between us no longer heavy, but something else, something easier, something undeniable. And for the first time since I met him, he looked at me without running. Neither of us spoke. We just sat there, shoulders barely touching. The only sound between us the quiet hum of the city outside. He wasn't running. He wasn't fighting. And that was enough. For now. I don't know how long we sat there. Minutes. Hours. Forever. But eventually, he exhaled. Slow. Deep. Steady. I never meant for this to happen. He murmured. I turned to him, watching the way the dim light caught the sharp angles of his face. Neither did I. He swallowed, his fingers twitching slightly against his knee. But I don't want it to stop. I added. His breath hitched. Then, so quiet I almost missed it. Me neither. The weight in my chest lifted. Not completely. Not all at once. But enough. Enough to know this wasn't a mistake. Enough to know he was worth waiting for. The next morning, he was still there. Still watching me with that unreadable gaze. Still looking like he was figuring something out. Still looking like he had already made a decision. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. I want to show you something. We drove out of the city. Miles of open road. The silence between us no longer tense, but calm. Eventually, we reached the edge of a wooded area. A hidden path cutting through the trees. This is your secret place? I asked. He nodded. Then, without another word, he took my hand and led me into the unknown. The clearing was breathtaking, a hidden pocket of the world. Untouched, forgotten, bathed in the golden light of the rising sun. I turned to him, my chest tightening. It's beautiful. His lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. This is where I come when I need to breathe. His voice was soft, softer than I'd ever heard it. And I knew, this wasn't just a place. This was his sanctuary, and he had just let me in. I stepped closer, reaching for his hand again. He didn't pull away, didn't tense, just let me hold him. And when our eyes met, when the sunlight caught his dark gaze, when he finally smiled, just for me, I knew we were going to be okay. Sometimes the things we fear the most are the things we need the most. Sometimes love finds you in places you never expected. He thought he was broken. He thought he couldn't love. But when he let me in, when he took me to that secret place, I knew he had never been alone. If this story made you feel something, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories about love, risk, and taking chances that change everything. Because sometimes, the best things in life happen when you stop running.